Welcome to the latest Mad Musings, where today we are looking at one of the biggest what-ifs in gaming history, FASA's Star Trek RPG, or as it's known in Japan, Commander Sulu, Master Navigator. Oh my! It's the evil twin system to West End Games Star Wars, where that one benefited greatly from the full cooperation from Lucasfilm. Star Trek had to deal with Paramount's increasing demands over the license, ultimately killing the game and undoing all the creations FASA gave to its universe. Everything that worked for West End Games ended up working against FASA. Despite its fate, it is still beloved by Trekkies, and the ship combat rules are held up today as one of the best designed vehicle systems ever. I'm Mr. Welch, and we come in peace. Shoot to kill, men. Enough of the Shatner voice. I'm not great at impersonations, and a little Kirk goes an awful long way. Star Trek is one of the oldest RPGs, dating back to 1982, also making it one of the original licensed games. It predates Star Wars D6 by 5 years. I know I keep comparing these two, but there are a ton of parallels between them, especially when it comes to the hazards of licensing. Especially when the company you are licensing from is Paramount. The game was designed for FASA by the Fantasy Simulations Association, with design credits going to Guy McLemore Jr., Greg Poline, and David F. Teppel. It was actually the fourth attempt to create a Star Trek game by FASA, but all previous designs kept breaking down into combat simulators, which is something that Star Trek wasn't. It was supposed to be about exploration, diplomacy, and banging green chicks. Finally, FASA had its system, and the Star Trek RPG was born. The system is a basic percentile mechanic, using your endurance stat for your health. It has several racial options for the various members of the Federation. With it being set entirely before the next generation, you've only got the core races in the Andorians, the Tellarites, Vulcans, and humans, with the addition of the Adosians and the Cadians from the cartoon, so three-legged and three-armed space mechanics, and cat people. Despite the cartoon not being canon, according to Paramount, they did spare the Cadians, who have been official since Star Trek IV. There are various stats for the characters, but the two stand out in character creation are luck and psionics. Psionics is mainly for Vulcans, as every race except them gets a massive penalty when rolling for it. And luck is all for the humans, because everybody else gets a penalty to that stat in character creation. The game is said to have two stats that rule them all, intelligence and luck. And they do give the most bonuses in character creation, with the high intelligence getting a huge number of bonus skills. Character creation is done by simulating each character's early career through the academy and their initial postings. Everybody does get a selection of bonus skills to start their characters with, which have nothing to do with their character's progression later on in the game. You pick these skills from a chart, and you can spend all of your points on one skill if you want, so you can maximize your unarmed combat or your shooting. Or if you really want to get into the Star Trek universe, put all your points into Winona Ryder trivia because she was in Star Trek. But then you get sent to the academy and have to start rolling on your advancement chart. And this is where the dice can be cruel, leaving you with a much older character with little to show for their career, because you couldn't roll less than a 60 trying to graduate from being a midshipman on a merchant ship, resulting in you being stuck there for a decade, while Captain Smirk, with his bonuses from luck and intelligence, graduated with honors on a Constitution-class starship in just a year. To make matters worse, if you fail your graduation attempt, you get penalized on your next roll. This game rewards success, but it also punishes failure. There is no failing out and just becoming an enlisted crewman. It says everybody has to be an officer because every character will be in charge of a section of the ship. There's no chief petty officers on the Enterprise. Everybody is an officer. That's not an exaggeration. It literally says that a starship is only crewed with officers. It does make the chain of command a bit complicated. The characters must talk to each other to decide who's going to be doing which job because the game doesn't handle overlapping roles very well. There can only be one person navigating the ship after all. While you can pawn off the role of captain to an NPC if necessary, somebody's going to want to sit in that chair. Since the game's system is entirely skill-based, the players can always switch out if one character is incapacitated or unavailable. It will still come down to whoever has the highest rating will want to make the tests. Where the system does succeed is by making sure that everybody has something to do. Character creation gives a lot of variety, so the engineer, security officer, and communications officer can approach the same problem differently. The game is all about skills. Even when you gain experience, you just take an intelligence test to gain new points. You can't raise your stats. This does prove once again that intelligence is the king of skills in Star Trek. That's the basics of the game. Straight up percentile with racial adjustments, 2 stats to dominate the system, and a vast number of skills. If that were it, it would be an okay system, if a bit boring. However, the background behind the game is what makes it famous. It was meant to follow Gene Roddenberry's dream, not to be a combat simulator. So ignore the gloriously detailed rules for combat in this one. Despite saying the RPG isn't about combat, it has rules for phaser blasting Klingons that would put numerous war games to shame. It does get around the disintegrations rather well by giving the players luck saves to avoid death, adding again to the god tier status of that particular ability. Also, the highest setting on a phaser drains an enormous amount of power. On a basic phaser, you've got 4 shots at the maximum level, compared to 20 shots at the lowest lethal setting. And much like Star Wars, the stun setting is far more powerful than the lethal setting, which makes sense considering this game doesn't want you vaporizing people for fun. Stun does 120 points of temporary damage compared to 20 or 40 points of lethal damage for those settings. That's a deliberate design choice. If you're an old school Trekkie, this game is a goldmine for the original series lore. They've got backgrounds on not just the original crew, but essential NPCs like Harry Mudd. There's a whole host of technobabble regarding all the cool toys you get to play with, and a background on the factions and races found on the TV show. This is greatly expanded upon with the numerous source books adding information on the Federation, Klingons, and Romulans that just weren't there in the 80s. FASA didn't have the same agreement like West End had with Lucasfilms, so none of the added lore was canon, but it was close enough for the fans of the show. They made an honest attempt to explain many of the continuity problems, fleshing out how Star Trek actually works, explained various statements in the show that set up lore that didn't go anywhere. Since this was years before Captain Picard baldly went where no man had gone before, it was precisely what the fans wanted at this point in time. But that's not what Paramount wanted. The game lasted until the Next Generation era, but the continuity problems reared up when large chunks of Star Trek lore were rewritten for the new show. Everything FASA created to try to explain the plot holes was obsolete, like Zephyr Cochrane going from an Alpha Centauran to a human. I don't want to even think of how much you would have to throw out the window with Enterprise and Discovery now, though many of my Trekkie friends will not acknowledge Kurtzman Trek if you held a disruptor to their head. The Star Trek RPG got one source book in the Next Generation era, but Paramount wanted to rework their licensed products and didn't like how the game handled the lore, so they yanked it. Last Unicorn Games got it almost 10 years later, and they started making the Next Generation games. They hoped to create a unified system for all the Star Trek shows at the same time, from the original series to Voyager. Then Paramount decided each and every show required its own license. Still, Last Unicorn persevered and made it to Deep Space Nine. Then Paramount canceled their license less than 2 years later and gave it to Decipher. Those guys changed the system, made a game that showcased every show until Voyager and started putting out books. Then they lost the license a few years later. Noticing a pattern here, people? I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with the new Modifius Star Trek RPG that just got printed. I'm just saying enjoy it while it lasts. Adding Prime Directive to the mix, that's, 5 versions of Star Trek RPGs over almost 4 decades? And all of them go away when Paramount decides they want more money? If you are seriously thinking about licensing from Paramount, you need to reread my first rule about licensing and then tattoo it on your forehead. Backwards, so when you look in the mirror, you remind yourself not to do it. Despite the legion of other RPGs in the same setting, FASA Trek will always be known for one thing: the Starship Tactical Combat Rules. That is considered one of the greatest RPG supplements ever made, as one of the holy texts for Trekkies everywhere. In other games, Starship Combat was done by the captain, rolling for the ship and anything related to combat. Many vehicle rules for other systems also became overly complicated for an RPG and became more of a war game than an RPG supplement. Not FASA Trek. They broke down the roles of vehicular combat between all the players, so everybody had something to do each round. The captain gave advice and could influence the other players. Still, the navigator flew the ship, tactical fired the phasers, science officer checked the sensors, engineer managed the power, and the communications officer reminded the Klingon captain his mother was a Tribble and his father smelled of Tranya. The Starship rules probably became more famous than the RPG for many Trekkies. You could build your own ships and fight it out with anything you could think of if you had all the correct books. The system was immersive, but it wasn't complicated. It captured the feel of Constitution-class cruisers exchanging phaser fire with birds of prey. You could recreate the Battle of the Motara Nebula with Khan Noonien Singh. The book was only 58 pages of rules, but they were all-encompassing. When you add in the ship construction guide, you got almost a new game in its entirety. Ship combat was so entertaining you could have an entire game session where it's the USS Rumbly Tumbly Rhino versus the invisible Gorn ship. That wasn't invisible because it had a cloaking device, but it would have cost too much to show on the original episode. And the players would still be on the edge of their seats. There are entire websites devoted to just the ship combat, ignoring the game. Boring beaming down to the planet and nailing the hot, half-naked green check. Star Trek did have a large number of supplements printed, and you can get most of them reasonably cheap. The game was mass-produced in its print run, making it one of the more cheaper pickups of the era. It made a lot of miniatures for the ship combat section. And those, on the other hand, are not cheap to find. They were some of the first miniatures made for Star Trek, and people collected them, and they still do. Not just RPG players, but Trekkies in general. Aside from a few movies, in the 80s, Star Trek was in a dry spell for actual swag. The miniatures became collector's items, and it got worse once the license was pulled. You can still find some of these collecting dust in older game stores, but it won't be the Enterprise or any of the other cool ships. Fortunately, there's many Star Trek ship miniatures these days, so if you need to play some FASA Trek, you've got a lot of plastic options now. The game is heavily supported online by a large fan base that constantly updates the game. It is the longest lived of all the Star Trek RPGs by a large margin. It had the most source books and adventures, and did try to add lore to a setting rather than just cut and paste from official Paramount sources that weren't available to them, compared to later versions. It could have been as big as Star Wars D6 was when it hit years later, but it didn't have the same relationship with Paramount that West End Games had with Lucas, and that was its fatal flaw. It had no permanence. Nothing it contributed would ever be taken into consideration by Paramount for future ideas. While West End Games gave the original trilogy reams of official names and stories, FASA's contributions were erased without a thought. It was original, it was well written, and it was imaginative, but it wasn't permanent. That's FASA Trek. It's one of the biggest what-ifs in gaming. It gave the fans what they wanted, and it gave it to them rapid fire. It made the best game mechanics in the vehicle combat system, and versions of it today are still being used by other systems like Rogue Trader. It expanded on a setting that had been stagnant for almost 2 decades, and people couldn't get enough of it. What it didn't have was the loyalty of the parent company. Rather than being given the lore to the next generation, Paramount killed the license. FASA Trek died before it could reinvent itself. The next game up is Delta Green, the Cthulhu sourcebook that exceeded its own expectations and became its own thing. The one that gives you the faintest bit of hope before it eats you. But until next time, get a life, will you people?